There's currently 10 corrupted weapons within Remnant 2. We got 5 back in October, and 5 more in February. My guess is that we're gonna get a couple more before the third DLC comes out, so I figured I would cover these in the batches they released in. This keeps the videos a bit shorter, and allows me to collectively get everything done before the final batch comes out. I kinda figured it would look a little weird if I had a video covering 10 corrupted weapons and then another one covering just 5. I also won't be going over the mechanics and functionalities of the original weapons in this video. Most of them haven't changed significantly enough to justify that. If you are interested as to how they work, for the most part my original videos covering the base game weapons still hold up. Without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off, we have Corrupted Aphelion. Instead of a singular laser projectile, this weapon fires out 3. And when all 3 projectiles land, it deals more damage than the original. Now this sounds all fine and dandy. One immediately glaring downside of the weapon is that you really can't land all 3 of them on a weak spot at the same time. Unfortunately, spread reduction doesn't help in this case. Thankfully it does overcome this downside by having decent damage and good stagger potential. Before the last major balance patch, this weapon actually had a negative 70% stagger reduction. Now it's plus 10%. This one change alone really makes it feel more like a laser shotgun. Anything that's not an elite enemy is easily stun-locked by the basic fire. My guess is they probably won't make spread reduction affect the weapon. As we've seen with previous patches, spread reduction has been kind of a problem for shotguns where they just make them better than the sniper rifles. So if Corrupted Aphelion could benefit from spread reduction, yeah, it would be better than the basic version in almost every way. I'd go even as far to argue that this weapon is even better for the basic fire crowd clear aspect than the original. It was already kinda hard to land weak spots on every enemy that you were piercing through, and while the beams on this variation aren't as long as the original, the fact alone that you're dealing increased damage per shot makes getting collaterals with this variation even more deadly. Its mod is a single target focused variation of the original. It fires out 5 orbs with much smaller blast radiuses. On their own, they deal much less damage than the original. However, if you do manage to land all 5, you can actually deal far more damage. The smaller blast radius does make this a little hard to achieve, but investing into amplitude does remedy the issue. The requirement to be closer to your enemies does make kinship even more necessary for this weapon. It's incredibly easy to one-shot yourself if you're not careful. Thankfully, or sadly, depending on who you ask, the mod no longer flings you a mile away if it hits you. I'm not gonna lie, I'm kinda sad this was changed. It was super funny doing sick tricks and jumps in the ward and other locations, but I do understand why it was fixed. Since it's hard to weak spot hit with all 3 beams, I decided to go with a body shotting build. Frenzy Dust and Rampage being my skills. For trinkets, I ran Void Idol, Anastasia's Inspiration, Blackout Ring, Braided Thorns, and Burden of the Gambler. For my mutator, I chose Bottom Heavy. My goal was to mag dump as fast as possible. Yes, I could have ran Bulletstorm, but I wanted to use Alchemist for a build, mainly for the concoctions. This was a surprisingly fun build. Most basic enemies just get annihilated within 1 to 2 shots. It's not too shabby against elites either. And in the scenario where you just need a bunch of damage really fast, the mod is still there. As I was recording for this video, there was one weird issue I noticed. Occasionally, when you go to reload, sometimes your guy will just melee attack. I believe this is from the input buffer. Half the time I was spamming left click to shoot, so I'm assuming what's happening is the game is retaining those inputs and canceling your reload. It's very strange. I don't think I've seen this on any other weapon. Besides that, I think the weapon is a great addition to the roster. After playing with it a little bit, I think I do enjoy using it a bit more than the base Aphelion, although I still prefer the original for ad clearing purposes, at least in mod setups. Moving on, we have Corrupted Deceit. This version fires its bolts back to back instead of at once. While the stat card of the original does show it being higher, this version's individual bolts actually add up to higher damage. This does come at the cost of having less crit chance and a smaller weak spot damage bonus. Its mod, Windfall, launches out a ring of blades that applies tainted blood to those hit by it. The debuff lasts 3 seconds, however you can tap the mod activation key while the ring of blades is flying to suspend it in air. This suspension lasts for 5 seconds. Once ended, it'll continue to fly off in whatever direction you shot it in. It's important to know that while the mod is actually out and flying about, you can't gain any mod power towards the next activation. Thankfully, you can tap the mod activation key after it's already been suspended to return to the player. Taking into account its much cheaper mod cost than the original, Corrupted Deceit is a pretty good side grade. The only issues I have with the weapon relate to the mod. Overall, I think the mod just feels clunky. Like, if you don't manually call back the mod, there's a good chance it's going to be gone for upwards of 10 plus seconds. There's also like a minimum amount of time that the Ring of Blades has to be out to be suspended midair. I've had multiple occasions where I tapped the button too fast and the input wasn't at the right time, so I end up completely whiffing the mod and it just goes flying by whatever I was aiming it at. With enough practice, you could certainly get over this weirdness. For me, it's a bit of a turnoff for using the weapon. Regardless, it still has very good potential. For the build, I wanted to stack as much charge speed as humanly possible. It's quite silly how strong charge weapons can be when you do get 90+% increased charge speed. Hunter's Mark, Bulletstorm, Worn Dog Tags, Anastasia's Inspiration, Feathery Binding, Archer's Crest, and Ring of Flawed Beauty. For the Mutator, obviously I went with Supercharger. You like Deceit? Well, this is pretty much just more Deceit, but with a slightly different playstyle. I think it's just as good as Deceit. Were the mod a bit nicer to use, I would probably run this more often. It's entirely up to you which version of the weapon you want to use. If there was one thing I could change about the mod, besides making it a little bit less clunky, it would be adding mod duration scaling to the spinning in place aspect of the mod. I mean, come on, even Ouroboros scales with mod duration. Coming up, we have Corrupted Merciless. This version is radically different than the original. It is a 3-round hit-scan DMR rifle. Its damage is on the higher end for long guns, however its small mag size is a pretty big issue. Thankfully, its mod is a weapon buff. We love those on this channel. The mod grants unlimited reserve ammo, boosts reload speed by 50%, applies bleeding on shots, and should you land 3 weak spot hits in a row, the weapon will perform a near instant reload. On paper, this sounds pretty good. The main issue I really have is the mod duration. 13 seconds. Very odd number. No pun intended. Every aspect of the buff is really good. However, the restrictive mag size really holds it back. Toss in one of the lowest fire rates out of all long guns and yeah, it's not amazing. Really makes that 13-second duration feel shorter than it is. There's one last nitpick I have about the weapon. It's more so about the crosshairs of Remnant 2. For some reason, this crosshair is super tiny. It's like a small circle. I kinda wish we had the option to set a custom color for our crosshairs at all times. As you'll see later on when I'm fighting Shrewd, my crosshair kinda just blends in and I have a hard time aiming, which is kind of important when your weapon is a sharpshooter type gun, where you need to land multiple weak spot hits in a row to reap the full benefit. Maybe if the crosshair was a cross and not a circle, this wouldn't be an issue. So, the deck is stacked against the weapon. What do we do? My goal with this build was to up the weak spot damage, mod duration, and mod power generation. Having the buff be active for longer more often should shorten the downtime from all the reloading we'll be doing. Hunter's Focus and Miasma were my choice of skills. For my trinkets, I ran Fragrant Thorn, Floodlit Diamond, Token of Favor, Burden of the Follower, and Zoe's Ring. For the Mutator, I was kind of split here. There's a couple you could pick for this weapon. Originally, I was gonna run Extender, and then I found out, because it's only 45%, the extra mag size is less than 1.5, so unfortunately that means it rounds down to just 4. So, to fit the theme of getting 3 weak spot hits in a row, I decided to use Ghost Shell. The fragment picks were the usual crit weak spot ones. I could have ran mod cost and duration to help boost the uptime even more, but I decided against it. While nothing special, I still kinda like this weapon. Despite the small magazine size and the necessity to land all your weak spot hits to get the full benefit, it's still kinda fun. The weapon certainly can carry itself for mobbing, especially if you use Hunter's Focus. And in those moments where you do manage to land all 3 weak spot hits on a boss, the damage isn't really that bad. In fact, I think the weapon just needs some small slight stat tweaks to be really good. I think the mod duration or cost should definitely be touched. Hell, maybe even get rid of the unlimited reserve ammo if it means we can have the mod active for like 20-25 seconds. Or just make the cost like 1,000, maybe even like 850. The magazine size could be upped, but I kinda like how it's a 3-shot, instantly reload the weapon sort of deal. The weapon is super close to being very good. Coming up, we have Corrupted Meridian. This version shoots rockets instead of grenades with a smaller blast radius. You can even charge up 3 of them to fire at once. Its mod fires a cluster bomb that explodes 8 times for 150 damage each. Compared to the base weapon, its mod damage per mod cost is around 13% more. This weapon has really solid damage numbers. It's essentially trading explosion radius for more concentrated damage. Without anything else boosting it, if all cluster bombs land on a target, it can actually take down most fodder mobs. Honestly, one of the biggest downsides I personally have with the weapon is how little ammo it feels like you have. I just want to do some super charge up shots and deal a bunch of damage at once, and when you do that all the time, you blow through the ammo. It was because of this that I was a little torn between which build I wanted to do, either just go for the primary fire damage or do a mod setup. I did have a build with the primary fire, although I did really bad with it, so I decided to just try out a mod setup instead. One really cool thing you can do if you decide to invest into the primary fire is that since Extender was buffed, it actually gives 3 more rockets instead of the original 2. So that means you can actually get out 3 bursts of 3 instead of 2 bursts of 3 and then a burst of 2, which is pretty cool. For the mod build, I decided to go with Archon Summoner, with my skills being Chaos Gate and Reaver. For trinkets, I went with Detonation Trigger, Burden of the Gambler, Burden of the Follower, Burden of the Warlock, and White Pawn Stamp. For the Mutator, I swapped between Failsafe and Feedback. If I wanted more damage, I chose Failsafe. If I wanted more sustain, I went with Feedback. Both are really good, and in the case that you proc the level 10 effect of Failsafe multiple times, you can get some really good damage out. As much as I do like Meridian, I think this one does edge it out a little bit, at least in terms of fun factor. I love rocket launchers, and this is pretty much a pocket rocket launcher. Definitely worth using on Apocalypse. Last but not least, we have Corrupted Rune Pistol. This one is in an interesting position. Unlike the original Rune Pistol, where it functions best in a team environment and during siege events, Corrupted Rune Pistol can be used pretty much in any setup, even in solo play. It's a higher damage dealing, fully automatic, albeit slower firing, version of the original. And I gotta say, that firing sound is beautiful. Very chunky, 10 out of 10. Its mod, Deathbrand, is very similar to that of the original, except in this case, all enemies marked take 10% more damage. Should you kill a Death-branded enemy, they'll drop a Deathbrand Echo. Picking this up increases your weak spot damage by 10% for 10 seconds. Right off the bat, you can see why this would be a more appealing option in solo play as opposed to the original Rune Pistol. However, it's worth pointing out that the Deathbrand is only a 10% damage increase. You know what else also gives a 10% damage increase for just left-clicking? Nebula. Granted, Nebula is pretty close range, unless you run trinkets that increase projectile speed, which for some reason makes you shoot further with it. Please Gunfire, just let weapon range affect how far the clouds travel, please. Corrupted Rune Pistol does have that slight edge over Nebula in the fact that its aura is a 25 meter radius. However, Nebula also has Nanoswarm, which also happens to apply a corrosive dot on hit. The only edge case that Corrupted Rune Pistol has over Nebula is that the 25 meter radius, which can be potentially increased wider if you have amplitude, can mark a bunch of enemies, even those that you're not focusing on. When you're out and about mobbing, this is pretty nice. Although in boss fights, most of the time you're going to be seeing the enemies and they're going to be coming towards you. In multiplayer it's a little bit different because your teammates might draw some aggro, but in that case you can just quickly tap fire Nebula to anything that's close to you or your friends. Yeah, it's possible to apply Corrode to your friends, but it's a pretty worthwhile trade-off in my opinion. One solution that comes to mind is just to up the Deathbrand damage bonus. Make it like 15-20%, and at that point it would be a worthwhile contender. You could even up the mod cost to compensate, and if you're feeling generous, you could up the weak spot damage bonus from the echoes. Those changes alone would make the weapon a lot more appealing. You might be asking, where's the build for the weapon? Well, just like the original Rune Pistol, I don't see this as a gun to build around. More than anything, it's a support tool. Just like Corrupted Merciless, all it needs is some slight tweaks to the mod and it'll be really good. And that's it for the first batch of Corrupted weapons. Which one of these is your favorite? Do you have any builds that made them feel fun or effective? Let me know down in the comments. The next video will probably be the other 5 Corrupted weapons. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.